Welcome to the next challenge of the course. In this challenge, we're going to build out a user form with 3 separate input fields, but I want to move all of the logic for keeping track of each input and its value to a separate useInput custom hook. So let's write out a base app component. I'm going to build out the form for you, and then I'll leave you to it to define the custom hook as well as its implementation in the app component. So in my app component, I'm going to return some basic JSX. So let's return here. And I'm going to put a user form. And in here, I'm going to start off my first input. So let's put an input tag. And this input is going to have a type of text. And the first thing I'm going to ask the user for is going to be their name. So I'm going to have a placeholder here called name. Afterwards, I know that I'm going to need something to store the value for this input. So I'm going to put the value attribute or prop, but I'm going to leave this empty for now because this is going to be what you are going to be filling in. And of course, the complementary attribute or prop here, in addition to value, is going to be onChange, which is going to update that value for us. So I'm going to copy this input twice below. So here's our second one and our third one. This one is going to ask the user for their last name, or in other words, their surname. And we're going to need complementary value and onChange properties here to make this input work. And here I'm going to alter things up a bit. I'm going to ask the user for their age, which is not going to be text, but is going to be a number. And of course, in order to make this functional, as I mentioned, I want you to define a custom hook that we're going to call useInput. So I'm going to define the basic function declaration here, but I'm going to leave the body blank. So your goal, your challenge for this assignment is to fill out useInput and then obviously to invoke it in the app component and make all of this functional. Now, obviously, since value and onChange here are empty, you can probably guess what you need to do to make this work. You're going to need to return some values from within our useInput hook, and then you're going to need to use them within these value and onChange props or attributes that are on our input. Now, of course, the useInput hook is going to return probably some kind of data structure that's going to allow us to store multiple properties, and they're all going to come in under the same name. So you might need to fiddle around with some ES6 features in order to make this functional and pretty elegant. I would look into renaming properties that you destructure off objects. That's probably the one idea that might come into play here. But otherwise, I'm going to leave you to it. So your goal is to make this a functioning form with 3 input fields that we can each edit and that are stored using React state. But of course, that state should not be defined in app. It should be defined in our useInput custom hook and then exported or returned out of it to be used in our app component 3 separate times for our 3 separate input fields. So go ahead and pause the video, give this a shot, then I'm going to show you my implementation as well as a way that I can refactor the code afterwards as well. So I'll see you in a few seconds. All right, so here's how I solved this challenge. I'm going to begin in my useInput custom hook. So the first thing I know here is I'm going to need to use the concept of React state to keep track of the value for each input. So I'm obviously going to need to invoke my useState hook. So I can begin by invoking the useState function, and I'm going to give it an initial starting point for each input of having an empty string. The next thing I need to do here is, of course, assign the 2 elements that I get back to in my array to 2 separate constants. In this case, I just called them value as well as set value. Notice that I didn't want to call them something like name or age or surname because it's not specific to any input, right? This is supposed to be a custom hook that just serves as a general all use case kind of input, right? So if I started introducing name in here, it would start connecting it directly to a specific implementation in a specific component. I want this to be as generic as I possibly can so that it can be used in as many places as possible. The next thing I need to do, of course, is to define a function that I can use in order to update the value of this input. So I defined a function here, which I conveniently called onChange. And of course, we can expect this to be given an event object. And what I need to do here is call my setValue function to update the value of my value state variable. And of course, as we've discussed many times before with input fields, we can expect our event object to have a target object, which is going to have a value property that represents the text that the user has typed in. Now, I need a way to export both my value, the current value that the user has typed, as well as my onChange function to update the value from within this useInput custom hook. The easiest way to do that is just in a plain JavaScript object. So I'm going to return an object that's going to include my value, my state variable, as well as my onChange handler, which I can pass to my onChange prop or attribute in my inputs below. So here, obviously, I have to invoke useInput, but this is probably the part where you may have encountered some confusion because we actually need to invoke this custom hook 3 times because we need 3 separate values being stored, the name, the surname, as well as the age. So we know we're going to need to invoke this 3 times. So I'm just going to write it out like so. And then what I did is actually use an advanced ES6 feature where we can actually rename the properties that we get back from our object that we get returned back to us from useInput. So I can do something like this. I can destructure, for example, value and onChange from my object that I get back as the return value from useInput. But unfortunately, I can't do the same thing below for these other two because we can't have 3 different constants named value or 3 different constants named onChange. So what I did is use this ES6 feature where I simply renamed the properties. I made this value equal to name, and the syntax for that is just putting a colon followed by the new name that you'd like to assign this one. So this value is representing my first name, so I called it the name, and I changed this one to be called handle name change. And once you understand this logic, it's very similar to repeat the same idea for the 2 invocations of the useInput custom hook below. So for this one, I call this value surname, and I renamed this onChange property that I get back from useInput to handle surname change. And once again below, I did the same thing, except this one represented my age, and this one represented handle age change. So now that I have these 6 constants available, name, surname, age, handle name change, handle surname change, handle age change, I was free to use them within the properties of my input fields here. So value for this one is going to be name, as well as handle name change. And the value for this one is going to be surname, as well as handle surname change. And the value for this one is going to be age, as well as handle age change. And I can go ahead and save this, take a look in my browser, and now everything looks to be working. So here's my name, here's my surname, here's my age, and it looks like each value is properly being displayed and registered, and each subsequent entry, each subsequent user press is updating the value of these 3 state variables currently called name, surname, and age, although each one of them, of course, behind the scenes is independent and simply called value within my useInput custom hook. An alternative solution to this, and perhaps a refactored solution to my first attempt, probably the most elegant way to solve this problem, is to simply get rid of all of these constants altogether. Because if you think about it, the value and onChange attributes here, or the props, depending on how you look at it, these all work in the exact same way. We need to display a value, which is always going to be whatever is the value of our value state variable, and we always need to pass in a function that's going to update that value, which again, that functionality remains the exact same right here. So if you realize that the functionality is the same across the board, you can actually get through this example without relying on any of the stuff right here. We can instead do something like this. I can clear out this code and simply destructure the object that I get back from invoking my useInput custom hook. All right, so let me take a second to walk through this because it's a little bit more of a complex concept here. But here's what's going on. I'm invoking the useInput custom hook that I defined above. I know that that hook is going to return to me an object with 2 properties, and those properties are always going to be value and onChange. What I can do is take that object that I get back as the return value of this function invocation and then destructure those 2 properties, value and onChange, to serve as my props or my attributes to my input field. So now my input will have a prop called value as well as a prop called onChange, and that's going to be responsible for keeping track of the name. But I'm not actually writing the idea of name or handle name change anywhere because React is just going to take care of all this behind the scenes. This useInput and its corresponding state variable and function to update the state variable are all going to be independent and kind of connected to this input automatically. So what I can do is just copy this syntax on line 26, paste it below right here, and paste it below right here. And remember, just because we're using the same state variable name like value, each state variable is independent. Remember back to our counter example where we created 3 different counters and we had the same use counter custom hook that each of our components relied on, and each component kept track of its own separate count. It's the same sort of idea here, except we're sparing the need for any kind of variables whatsoever. We're going to have a separate value state variable that's going to be exported out of this JavaScript object, and we're simply going to use it here as the value prop that we pass into input. And the same thing goes for our onChange handler function right here. So I can get rid of everything here, lines 17 through 19, and when I refresh the page, you'll notice it's still going to be a functioning app. We can still fill in these fields. And I think that is the most kind of beautiful and elegant and simple solution because we've spared the need for variables, and our app component simply relies on or is simply responsible for rendering a basic slice of JSX. It doesn't have to take care of any of the business logic for updating any of those input fields because we've completely extracted that to our useInput custom hook. Here we just used our useState hook to define the idea of a state variable called value, as well as a function to update that value called setValue, which we invoke in a change handler, which we called onChange, and we export both the current value of the state variable as well as the change handler, which we can pass to any input field, and then we rely on that custom hook inline by destructuring those two object properties as props for our input field right here, and thus we can reuse this hook anytime we need to use an input, and the only thing we need to customize, of course, is the type as well as the placeholder that we're going to display here. That's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one.